we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us for our September meeting of the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force. We've got great presentations for you today. Per usual, we will start with some policy updates before diving into them. So I'm going to shift things over to Caitlin.
Hi everyone, this is Caitlin Sider at the National Housing Conference. So our first update is around appropriations. So Congress is now back in session and they have a lot on their plate for the month of September. Funding for the federal government runs out on October 1st, and the debt ceiling is set to expire in mid-November. Also in September, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and the National Flood Insurance Program all need to be extended. And Congress is currently working on an aid package for those affected by Hurricane Harvey. The House just passed a $7.85 billion emergency spending package for Hurricane Harvey victims, and now it's going over to the Senate. We're expecting them to attach a debt ceiling increase to that package, and then it'll go back over to the House, where it's going to have a harder time getting passed. Notably, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi met with President Trump and their Republican counterparts earlier today, and they both offered Democratic support for a Hurricane Harvey aid package that includes the debt ceiling increase, and that debt ceiling increase would be until mid-December, I'm sorry. And so kind of stepping back from all of this, for fiscal year 18, sequestration will be in full effect, and this is the first time that the law will have full impact since the 2011 law took place, because Congress has found ways to bump up funding each fiscal year. But a deal has not been reached for fiscal year 18 yet, and the fiscal year starts on October 1st. So yesterday, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy said the Republicans plan to pass a 3-month funding bill, which will keep the government funded till mid-December. So that would line up with the debt ceiling increase that we think is going to be attached to the Harvey bill in the Senate. If they push both of those things until mid-December, it'll give them time to potentially work on a bipartisan budget deal to raise the spending caps and not have sequestration take full effect for fiscal year 18. So stay tuned, and it looks like mid-December is going to be when a lot of these things are going to be hammered out.
I'm going to jump in with just one clarification, Caitlin, because that was a great summary, but it may have gone a little fast for some folks. There's a big difference between appropriations, which is Congress appropriating funds to fund ongoing activities, and the debt ceiling increase, which allows Treasury to keep issuing debt to pay for money we've already spent. It's a little unusual to have such a short-term debt ceiling increase, and I think that probably reflects the opposition from a minority of the majority in the House. There's a small but large enough number of Republicans who are pushing hard against raising the debt ceiling without offsetting changes in federal spending generally, which has historically had been how the issue was used, that the debt ceiling increase was a vote and a public opportunity to have debates about the long-term spending policy. Often that was a minority challenging a majority. In this case, the Republicans are the majority. And so one of the risks that the country runs of not raising that debt ceiling is that it can affect our credit rating. We've already seen this once in a small way before. If the credit rating of the United States internationally is lowered, it means it costs us more to borrow money. So all those treasury bills that the federal government issues every month, every year to pay for the operation of the government and all the mandatory and discretionary programs, the interest rate's just higher, and it just makes it that much harder to get out of debt. Now, if the unthinkable happened and the U.S. actually failed to raise the debt ceiling and therefore failed to pay off its bonds, that could actually be catastrophic for the world economy because so many other foreign governments hold U.S. debt. So that's why the debt ceiling is really a separate beast. It is getting rolled into these talks because of the way it's being treated by some in Congress, but it really is a separate issue in and of itself, and it's worth keeping those straight.
And part of the logic for attaching it to the Senate bill now for the Hurricane Harvey is to get it done with and kind of out of the way, because the Treasury has said they can go until mid-October, but it doesn't have a firm date like some of these other things where we have to do it by this date. But as Ethan mentioned, the closer and closer we get to the debt ceiling, the lower our credit rating goes, and we want to avoid that. We just want to get it done with as early as possible. Like, I think Mnuchin was saying that he wanted it done before they left for August recess. That did not happen, so we want to get it done with very quickly.
Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has been talking about this all summer and asking for a clean debt ceiling increase. And that's why I'm a little surprised it's such a short-term measure. I've been looking for reports that talked about the length, because plenty of people were saying, push it out until 2018, 2019, get it past the midterm election, so it's not a political football. It doesn't seem to be the direction they're going. But as you started with, this is all developing very quickly. I mean, the House voted this morning on the Harvey aid package. So all of this could change. Rather than belabor it further, I'm going to pass the baton back to Rebecca.
Okay, thanks, guys. And just want to remind folks, if you do have questions about any of the updates or as we get into the presentations, just feel free to send them at any time through the chat box, and we will include them in our discussion. I did want to touch on a couple other policy updates very quickly. Again, I have great presenters for you, so I want to really get to them quickly. But I wanted to make sure everyone was aware that HUD had come out delaying their small area FMR rule. So for the PHAs covering the 23 metro areas that were going to have mandatory implementation, it's been delayed for at least 2 years. So that's October 1, 2019. Other provisions of the final rule remain in effect, and PHAs can still choose to implement the small area FMRs voluntarily, but this is just removing the mandatory requirement, leaving it only in place for Dallas, which is under a court order to do so. And HUD has also come out with the interim evaluation of small area FMRs, which is also interesting to take a look at. So just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And in NHC land, we came out with a new publication this summer on allocating housing funds. This came out of our Inclusive Communities Working Group, and it's principles to help states and local governments in allocating resources for housing. So that's on our website, but we'll include the link in the notes. But again, just wanted to raise that for you.
And it's worth noting that I think both of our speakers today either participated as regular members or as guest speakers at the Inclusive Communities Working Group meetings. And so they get kudos for their input on the publication and none of the blame for any of the goofs in it, which I hope are few and far between.
And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was just that the Federal Housing Finance Agency did recently announce they are going to extend HARP, the Home Affordable Refinance Program, through December 31st, 2018. They are still working on their streamlined refinance program related to their credit risk transfer program and making sure they can accommodate the high LTV streamlined refinance. So they are extending HARP while they work on that. So again, just want to make sure people were aware. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. First up, we have Stacy Young, who's the Director of the Preservation Compact in Chicago with the Community Investment Corporation there. And then she will be followed by Margaret Kaplan, who's the Community Development Director at the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. So, and their presentations are on different aspects of the small multifamily housing space. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy. Give me just 1 second to pull up her presentation.
Great. I'll go ahead and get started. So before we dive into the slides, as Rebecca said, I'm Stacy Young. I work at Community Investment Corporation. I'll be referring to that as CIC throughout the rest of the presentation. And as she said, I direct the Preservation Compact, which is a policy collaborative to preserve affordable rental housing in Chicago and Cook County. The Preservation Compact and our partners work hard on keeping the affordable rental stock in good condition. A lot of the time that is in weak markets and strong markets. In strong markets, we work with subsidy to try to either preserve the subsidy that's already on buildings in those markets. And I'll talk a little later on about a new program we're starting to try to create and preserve new affordable units in strong markets, but more on that later. For now, I'll give some basics on CIC. So again, CIC's core activity is lending. And again, I'll get some more detail on our lending programs. We're a community development finance institution. And our activity started with our multifamily loan program, which is a loan consortium. So the idea is it's a shared risk model where lenders buy notes based on the loans that we finance here at CIC. We've been using this model for about 35 years to finance the acquisition and rehab of naturally occurring affordable housing, as we call it now. We just call it affordable, we just call it rental housing in low and moderate income markets. But I'll talk a lot more about sort of the work we do and our small lending programs in the context of naturally occurring affordable housing. So we do mostly work in low and moderate income neighborhoods, and we mostly are lending to small and mid-sized for-profit owners. We do some work with nonprofits, but for the most part, we think about them as mom and pops sometimes, but that makes them sound small and insignificant. Really, I mean, these are the guys who own a lot of the affordable rental that's in our neighborhoods in Chicago. So again, our largest multifamily pool is $200 million. We have 40 lender investors. We have a number of other complementary programs in addition to lending programs, and I'll talk about those at the end of the presentation. But just to give you some idea of scale, our aggregate overall lending numbers since 1984, we have financed $1.2 billion, and that's 58,000 units to house 145,000 people. So those are sort of our big since lending activity inception. Last year, and I will just say, I think we're on track this year to finance about $65 million. Our multifamily program last year was $43 million. And then we have an energy retrofit program that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And we also have a program targeted just to 1 to 4 unit buildings. And that was about $7 million, and we're doing even more on that program this year. So in a couple of minutes, I'll talk about more about the neighborhoods where CIC lends and who our owners and tenants are. But first, here's a map, again, just to give you a context of Chicago and our neighborhoods. So in Chicago, like other markets across the country, we've seen big contrast between neighborhoods who see different levels of investment activity. Some of those neighborhoods are booming with investment and values and rents and homeownership activity is all very high. On the map that you see, those are the dark blue areas. And then, of course, if you look to the lighter blue neighborhoods, those are low and moderate income neighborhoods. So I know some other coastal markets and other markets across the country perhaps don't see this scale of low and moderate income neighborhoods. But here in Chicago, these are the neighborhoods where CIC is active. These are the neighborhoods where there's a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. Again, most of it unsubsidized. I'll talk about that in a minute. In these weaker neighborhoods, the values are low and responsible. And the responsible owners that I just talked about, these for-profit owners, they typically buy those buildings at lower prices, and then they can set the rents at neighborhood levels and still maintain a high occupancy. So I'm going to talk a lot more about those owners, these responsible owners who are for-profit, who own the majority of the affordable rental in those lighter blue neighborhoods and on the map. They're not light blue here in Chicago, just light blue on the map, just so you know. So the next slide, again, I'm going to talk about naturally occurring affordable housing, and again, the small multifamily notion within the NOAA context. You've seen the map, and I just again, to define my terms, I feel like people say NOAA and they might mean different things. So for what I'm talking about today, I just said this, but just to be clear, NOAA and weak markets as I think about it, it's just plain old unsubsidized affordable rental housing. And the strategies to preserve that type of housing is to make sure it stays in good condition, to make sure the owners stay strong. NOAA, in strengthening markets, is also affordable rental, but again, by definition, we talk about how we are going to lose those buildings over time because the values are going up and the rents are going up, so it will no longer be affordable. So our strategies in those markets are similar, but a little bit different because we really want to create incentives to keep those buildings affordable over the long haul. So, you know, in weaker markets, we'll talk some more about what CIC does in terms of financing a lot more. But those bullets say it all. I'm sure you guys are familiar with all of these things, but financing, making sure there's a strong credit flow for acquisition and rehab activity to keep those buildings strong, cutting operating costs, making sure that energy bills are as low as they can be, and property taxes as predictable as they can be. As I said, we all know about unsubsidized buildings that are owned and operated by irresponsible owners. So we work hard to make sure that owners are strong so that, you know, again, when I say that we do most of our financing in low and moderate income neighborhoods to smaller owners, these are also typically to smaller buildings. So it's really important that the owners are strong. It's easier to maintain a 200-unit building than lots of 24-unit buildings. And of course, it's important that we have easy to navigate, clear codes and processes through the municipality. And that's something that we work with the City of Chicago and Cook County on here as well through the Preservation Compact. Next slide talks a little bit about the stock here, and I've got a lot more detail about the stock in the City of Chicago and across the country. But, you know, just so we're thinking in the same context about small buildings, in Chicago, about 50% of the rental stock is in 1 to 4 unit buildings. And by that, about 10% of the rental stock is in single family homes. About 40% of the rental stock is in 2 to 4 unit buildings. So that's a big chunk of the rental stock that's in 1 to 4 unit buildings. And of course, after the crash, like many of you, I'm sure, you know, that part of the stock in our weaker markets was devastated. And that's when CIC really became more interested in that stock to keep the neighborhood strong, but also to keep the blocks where our multifamily investments were located to make sure those blocks stayed strong as well. So we created a couple of programs around the 1 to 4 stock that I'll talk about in a minute. So in terms of the 5 to 49 units, in Chicago, that's about 30% of the rental stock. So a big chunk of the stock here is, you know, units that are less than 50, buildings that are less than 50 units. And those are the units and buildings, those are the buildings least likely to be financed by the by banks in the conventional market because they're just more time and trouble. So the 70% of affordable rental being unsubsidized is a statistic from the Joint Center on Housing Studies. There's other statistics on that. But again, this is a function of those weak markets. I'm kind of making the same point over and over again. In weak markets, the rents are already affordable because the values are low. It's a really important investment for CIC to make because again, that is the majority of the affordable rental stock, and that is where the most vulnerabilities are. Again, these are smaller owners and they need our help, and they actually don't like subsidy very much. It comes with a lot of strings and they want to avoid those strings. So in order to finance and keep those buildings strong, they're looking to the market. And again, that's the most efficient way to go when it comes to providing resources for these buildings. We know that federal subsidies are always getting smaller, especially now. Those resources are dwindling. So in order to best finance these private market owners who do own the majority of the stock, we don't need subsidies. So let's figure out ways to strengthen that segment of the market. So still on this slide, again, just to give you an idea of what we do, here in Chicago, the median income of the census tracts where we do our financing is about 55% of AMI. And of the buildings that we are financing, the vast majority of the units are affordable to households at or below 60% of AMI. As you go lower, about 77% of our buildings and units are affordable to households at 50% of AMI. And you can imagine sort of how that goes on down the scale. So the next slide really looks at owners and tenants, again, just to understand who we're lending to. These are a lot of small business people, as I said. A lot of the owners that we finance are minority or women-owned businesses. And a lot of the tenants that are living in our buildings are earning less than $40,000 a year, and a third are earning less than $20,000 per year, which makes sense because we do also estimate that about a third of the units that we finance have HCV holders living in them. So again, I'm just going to talk for a minute about these owners. These are the owners that we finance, of course, are responsible owners. They're owning the majority of this small stock, and that's whether you're talking about the 5 to 50 unit buildings or the 1 to 4 units that are being rented out. They don't want to mess around with subsidy, which again drives a more efficient way of providing resources to them. So in our next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the many different programs that CIC administers, in addition to our multifamily loan pool, which I mentioned before. Being able to finance these owners to acquire and rehab the properties is critical. During the crash, you all know credit was choked off in lots of different markets, but definitely in those weaker markets, CIC was still out lending, and we were a really critical resource. We remain a resource, but lots of other lenders have jumped into these markets, which is great. The more the merrier, as long as everybody is, number one, lending to the responsible owners, and number two, of course, doing responsible lending themselves. So the 1 to 4 unit rental redevelopment loan program is a program, as I said, that we began in the midst of the crash, and after the crash, recognizing that there was a gap in financing for these smaller buildings, especially for investors to buy groups of these buildings, because doing a group of these buildings kind of fell between the single family space at a conventional lender and the commercial space. So CIC created a $26 million loan pool. It's been very successful, made an impact in neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods where we're trying to work with the city of Chicago to target efforts. The city has a program that focuses on 13 very small neighborhood areas. So we are opportunistic, and we will respond to investors that come along and ask for money. But again, in the 1 to 4s, we recognize that making an impact in these markets meant trying to focus geographically to a large extent. That program has been so successful that we've expanded it. It started off as $26 million. We recently expanded it to $50 million, and now are working for another 2 years to get that money out the door. Our Energy Savers program is simply it's a financing program to do energy retrofits. It fits into our larger multifamily loan program, but the terms for borrowers that are financing energy retrofits are a little more favorable. And I'd be happy to talk about that. But again, The multifamily pool, we will finance buildings of any size, but the vast majority of the buildings that we're doing are less than 50 units, which, as I keep saying, is the majority of the stock here. And of course, our property management training program, next on the list. I keep talking about keeping these owners strong. So we do lots of classes. The city of Chicago looks for us to train owners when they feel like owners need that training. They look to us to give advice to owners when they have questions. And I believe that about 1,000 owners go through that training every year. And, you know, part of that is Scared Straight too. If they're just considering whether to become an investor, we try to make sure that they understand that this is not an easy business. We also have a part of CIC that does direct property interventions. The Troubled Buildings Initiative is a partnership with the city of Chicago, and CIC acts as a receiver on properties where the city finds code violations and brings them to court, so that we can become the receiver, make the changes, do the rehab as ordered by the court, and bring those buildings back up to snuff. And of course, the Preservation Compact, that's me. We do a lot of investigation and identification of issues, strategies, challenges related to preserving affordable rental with all of our partners, developers, lenders, for-profit, nonprofit, tenant advocates. And we've identified some of these programs that I just described, and again, work with our partners to execute those strategies and programs. The last thing is a strong market fund that I won't get into detail in now, but once again, the idea is, without getting into some heavy subsidy and multi-layered financing and a lot of time-consuming efforts, we're creating a fund that will provide an incentive for owners to buy existing multifamily rental in strong markets, and then create 20% affordability with operating subsidy, which in Chicago is pretty readily available through the Housing Authority. And they're also very interested and anxious to get that operating subsidy into strong markets. So we're trying to, again, work with the market to create affordability, and this time in strong markets, in order to ensure that there's opportunities for households in those strong markets as well, when those households need affordable units. That's it. I'm happy to take questions after the next presentation.
Great, thanks, Stacy. So we will pull up Margaret's presentation. All right, Margaret, are you ready?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So hello, my name is Margaret Kaplan. I'm the Community Development Director at Minnesota Housing. And I'm going to start my presentation with 3 caveats. One is, as the Community Development Director, I have the great good fortune to talk about excellent work that other people are doing. So there may be some questions that arise I might not have the answers to, but I can certainly tell you who can answer those questions. The second is that we're in the middle of our office move right now, and so I may be experiencing a number of technical difficulties, but we'll sort of soldier forth. And the third is that I have at least one slide in here that is a very egregious use of me playing around with our new template for PowerPoints, and you'll notice it when you reach it. So Minnesota Housing is a state housing finance agency. We operate a vast array of programs, everything from programs to prevent and end homelessness, through developing supportive housing, providing capacity building funds to nonprofit organizations and some of our delivery partners for programs. We do first-time home buyer mortgages, home improvement loans, and we also are the primary allocator of low-income housing tax credits. We are a state agency, so we do also receive some state appropriated dollars. You can flip to the next slide. And so our mission is we believe housing is the foundation for success. So we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance affordable housing. And because of the sort of wide range of activities we do, we serve over 60,000 households a year, and we provide over $1 billion in a variety of different kinds of funds on both single-family, multifamily, and on kind of a counseling services and capacity building grant side. So it's a pretty wide range of issues. You can flip to the next slide. So why are we looking at this issue of unsubsidized affordable housing right now? As a statewide agency, we tend to look at things from sort of both a very broad level, kind of the statewide level. Ooh, and my computer just went out, so that'll be interesting. So we look at things statewide, but we also look at things on the very local level as well, too. Oh, there we go. So across the state, what we're noticing is that there are a wide number of communities with vacancy rates that are under 3%. And this is true both in our large cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul and Duluth, but we're also seeing this in some of our smaller workforce communities around the state. And because of this high demand, what we're seeing is that the cost of rent is increasing without necessarily seeing an improvement in the quality of the housing that's available. We're also seeing across the state that rents are rising, but incomes are falling. And more recently, there have been a number of very high-profile conversions of large unsubsidized affordable housing buildings to market rate. For folks who haven't had the opportunity to kind of track what's going on, particularly in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, really kind of a catalyst for discussion here was the conversion of a building in Richfield that was almost 700 units of unsubsidized affordable housing to a higher market rate level. And one of the things that we've noticed is that even when the end rents are still what would technically be considered affordable in our metro area, they're still not affordable to the people who are currently living there. So there was a real need to look at strategies that would address some of these larger conversions in some of the markets in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, where with a little bit of rehabilitation, buildings could command significantly higher rents. At the same time, one of the things that we were seeing in some of our rural communities was that there were significant needs to address what was happening with the rental housing stock, and that those strategies had to be very different than what you were seeing maybe in some of the larger metropolitan areas. A lot of this is because the folks who own the rental housing in our rural communities are significantly different than some of the larger owners that we're seeing in the metropolitan area, and you had sort of this different balance and dynamic, both with the level of city capacity to address some of the condition issues that existed in the rental housing stock, and in rural communities, the vast majority of rental housing was in some of these smaller scale developments. And so all of this kind of came together right now for us to be looking at a number of different strategies. The first strategy I'm going to talk about is one I'm not going to spend much time on, but this is really looking at sort of metro area, large scale rental housing. So the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, ironic with their name, created the NOLA Impact Fund to address the preservation of unsubsidized affordable housing in the Twin Cities metro area. And they were really asked to do it because there was a piece of research that was done called the Space Between report that identified the loss of unsubsidized rental housing as the major kind of risk and challenge that we were going to be facing in the metro area. That report came out in 2013. It was done by Deirdre Schmidt, and I would highly recommend people taking a peek at it if you ever get a chance, because it really, I think, anticipated some of the challenges that it took us a few years to see. Phase one of the NOAA Impact Fund is to preserve 1,000 units, and that's a really bad typo, of unsubsidized affordable housing in the Twin Cities metropolitan area using $25 million in social impact capital paired with first mortgage financing. The initial goal was to deploy the funds over 14 months, but based on a presentation from the person who's currently running the NOAA Impact Fund, Rachel Robinson at Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, who is just very smart and could tell you just a ton about how this is working. But she was doing a presentation to Metro Cities, which is an organization of sort of city governments, and said that due to high demand, they're likely to deploy the funds completely by early next year. So they're really seeing a lot of traction with this. And once again, that $25 million in social impact capital is going to allow them to tap into first mortgage financing. And the goal is to identify buildings that are at risk of loss of affordability through sale and basically offer to purchase those either very mission-driven nonprofit or for-profit owners looking at primarily some of the larger scale rental housing in the Twin Cities metro area. And in some ways, this is very much kind of that hot market strategy. So if you flip to the next slide, though, one of the things that Minnesota Housing has been doing for quite a few years is very much a small scale strategy that's focused on some of our more rural communities across the state of Minnesota. As I mentioned, over 50% of the rental housing in greater Minnesota is in buildings that are 4 units or less, and quite a lot of these are single family homes. And there are some areas around the state where those numbers are much higher of the single family home and small unit rentals. And as we went around the state and had discussions with some of our greater Minnesota communities, we heard this issue of small-scale rental rehabilitation needs as a consistent theme, as a consistent challenge for communities. There was a sense that the condition of some of the housing maybe wasn't in the greatest shape. There was a real threat of loss of affordability, but also loss of the housing as sort of habitable housing opportunities for folks. And the owners of the small-scale rental housing are very different from the owners of some of the larger scale rental housing. So what they were looking for and what they needed and the process that would work for them would be very different than we were seeing in maybe some of the larger scale rental properties. So based on this, several years ago, we created a program called the Rental Rehab Deferred Loan Program, called RRDL frequently, although I do so hate acronyms. But it's intended to preserve affordability of small-scale rental properties in greater Minnesota communities. And we have 3 different strategies that we're utilizing through the RRDL program. One is for the larger small-scale rental properties. Building owners can apply directly to the agency to work with us, and we can provide loans for rental rehabilitation and preservation. It's a 0% interest loan, and the term is 10 to 30 years based on the size of the loan. We do have limits on the amount that we can do both per property and per unit. So we can do a deferred end or construction loan of up to $300,000 total for the building, and that's up to $25,000 per unit for these multi-unit properties. And the owner has to agree to maintain the rent and income restrictions, and there are some reporting requirements as well. And so a number of the properties we've done that are a little bit larger, they will apply directly to us. But primarily, most of our work is done through a network of administrators across the state. And we have some who work with some of the larger unit buildings. And by larger unit buildings, I mean primarily buildings with units, 20 units and below for the most part. And then another set who will work with the smaller 1 to 4 unit buildings. For the multi-unit, so above 4 units, it's still a 0% interest loan with a term of 10 to 30 years, and 10% of it is forgivable. But for the smaller 1 to 4 unit building, it's a 0% interest loan that's 100% forgivable if they maintain their affordability for a certain period of time. And part of that is because we realized that for a lot of folks, the barriers of repayment were so significant, and so much of the rental housing stock that was in that 1 to 4 unit space in some of our rural communities was in condition where it really needed this infusion of resources. And we kind of felt like in order to make sure that those resources were getting to the much needed communities, and in order for folks to be working with us, we needed to make more of it forgivable. You can go to the next slide. So there are definitely some challenges associated with doing this kind of work. The rental rehab deferred loan program is still in pilot, so we're still trying to work out some of how this can work best. And actually right now, we're starting a pretty robust examination of the program in order to determine whether there are program changes that need to be made and whether the program is actually achieving the outcomes that we want it to. We've certainly done a lot of properties and been able to deploy a great many resources, but there are still things that we need to work on. First of all, because we're working through a network of administrators, and this is really important, both in order for the work to actually get done, but also because it's those local organizations that can have these deeper relationships with some of the owners in their communities. But administrator capacity is a real challenge, and this is absolutely no critique of the organizations out there. It's just that some of our Greater Minnesota organizations are operating a wide array of programs, so the requirements that are placed upon them for operating multiple programs can be pretty steep, and so making sure that not only are we depending on them, but that we're also providing the tools and resources that they need in order to be successful. Related to that, both from an administrator capacity standpoint, but also from the standpoint of working with some of the smaller scale landlords, particularly folks who own very few properties, who are predominantly operating these 1 to 4 unit rentals, is trying to figure out what the best underwriting standards are. We're constantly trying to balance, on the one hand, being good stewards of public resources, because we're using state appropriated dollars, about $7.4 million a year, to operate this program. So we have to be very responsible in how we use those. And at the same time, we need to set those underwriting standards in a way that's going to work for some of the smaller scale landlords, and particularly for some of the very small scale landlords operating in that 1 to 4 unit space. Sometimes there's a lot of commingling between people's personal finance and their business finance, and so we can't really think about it the same way as we think about our typical, larger multifamily developments. Another challenge, and I think Stacy did a good job of hinting at this a few times, is there is a reluctance by some owners to work with the government. And that is, I think, a very valid concern. Government can be very difficult to work with, and so we need to figure out, as we create sort of standards and reporting, how we effectively calibrate what we're asking for so that we're seen as a resource and not as a challenge. Another challenge that is associated with this program, and you can definitely see this play out as you look at where it's most effective, is there are some areas around the state where the rents are very high regardless of the condition of the housing units. And so sometimes that means there is a lack of motivation to address some of those condition issues. Once again, I don't think it's sort of a lack of interest by landlords in making sure that their properties are in reasonable condition, but they would be, in many cases, taking on debt and taking on some restrictions on their property and accepting some reporting requirements. And so thinking about that exchange in some of the higher rent rural communities can be quite a challenge. And lastly, and this is really a resource question more than anything else, at times the cost of the necessary repairs is in excess of the program limit. So this program can work very well if you have a certain level of fix-up that needs to happen within the housing units, but there's a point at which those needs are going to be above the $25,000 per unit that exists for, our above 4-unit buildings, or in the single-family space, the 1-4s, we can go up to $35,000 a unit. But at times, if there's a lot of deferred maintenance, we can run into challenges with that as well. And this also becomes an issue with some kind of a loan-to-value work. So you can flip to the next slide. So this is my egregious use of our new PowerPoint template. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is that these strategies, the RRDL program strategies, work best when the resources are paired with really strong local policy. So if you have a community, for instance, that has a rental housing code where you're pairing some inspections and some real push for landlords to address some of the deferred maintenance issues, if that's paired along with resources to address that deferred maintenance, that typically works better than when it's just the dollars alone. The other kind of local policy piece that we're seeing in the Twin Cities metro area is that there are a number of communities that are creating their own programs to address some of the deferred maintenance on smaller scale rental rehab, as well as a number of policies really trying to be very proactive about things like notice requirements and tenant protections. All of these allowing more mission-focused owners, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, to get ahead of some of the challenges that exist with sort of the purchase, rehab, and increasing rents in some of our rental properties, both in the Twin Cities metro area and in greater Minnesota. And I think that's my last slide. I'm going to leave it at that. Here's my contact information, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions folks have.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much to Stacey and Margaret for those excellent presentations. Thanks for taking the time to be with us and share all of that wealth of information. We will open up for questions, and I think Ethan had one ready to go.
I do, and I want to echo Rebecca's thanks to both of you. I think one thing that might help it bring this issue a little more concretely to folks is, a description of an interaction either of you have had with an individual landlord. I think to an experience we had with the Inclusive Communities Working Group, and I think you were on this tour when we were in Alexandria, in Arlington County here near the district. We talked with, one of the owners who runs and operates basically unsubsidized rental housing. It's still comparatively inexpensive. And the sort of the challenges he's run into on the financing side, on the operations side, the strategies he uses to retain tenants. So I'd welcome an anecdote from either or both of you about an interaction you have had or observed with, some of the folks who own and operate this affordable housing, this rental housing without subsidies, just to give us a better sense of what their business model is, what their perspective is, and what they're aiming for. Arbitrarily, I will call on Margaret first, but I would love to hear from Margaret and Stacey.
Sure. So one thing I will sort of caveat this all with, of course, is this is a little bit once removed because, we are working with that network of administrators, and I think that is very, very helpful for us just in terms of kind of bridging that space between kind of government and some of the small scale business owners. But we do have these events around the state that we call housing and community dialogues, and we bring together a large number of people. It's really kind of a big tent discussion in subregions around the state and rural communities. And so I have had some really interesting opportunities to talk with some of the folks who are some of these small scale rental owners. And it's really interesting because I think from very far away, you can look at what's happening with rental housing conditions, and it's pretty easy to ascribe some bad motives to people. But I was talking to this guy at a housing dialogue in Winona, Minnesota, which is kind of a small city, kind of a workforce community with a lot of colleges, who owns a lot of single and duplex rental housing. And from his perspective, the work that they're doing in their community is they are both, think of themselves as both a serious business person and as somebody who's providing a real service to the community. And so I think as we interact and design programs, we have to take both of those perspectives into mind. They're trying to do something that's going to be a business model that works for them, but they also really do think of themselves as an important community asset as well. And sometimes that can create a little bit of tension with us as a state agency as we're trying to create more affordable rental housing that they see as sometimes competing with the housing that they have and interrupting their broader business model.
So this is Stacy. I'm gonna jump on top of that and give Ethan a little bit of a hard time for the question, since you made them sound a little bit like creatures from outer space. But that's okay, Ethan. I love you. And this is something, these are folks that we deal with every day of the week, right? I mean, they own the majority of the stock. They don't look like a lot of the nonprofit mission-driven developers that I work with, because they're not meeting with the city every day about policies. They're not connected to this larger network of the usual suspects. In Chicago, I know all of the developers who work with subsidy, and the city knows all of them because they're out and about. These smaller guys are out in the middle of the night, doing whatever, fixing someone's sink, fixing a water problem somewhere. They're on the ground, and they're doing a lot of this work themselves, which is a blessing and a curse. So they're mean and lean. A lot of the capacity building that I mentioned before has to do with, this is again on both sides. Some of these guys, Margaret, you said it perfectly. They're business people. They think they're doing a service to the community, and if they're unsophisticated, their problem isn't that they've got really high rents and they're evicting people all the time. A lot of the time, the problem is the opposite. They don't raise their rents when they should, and they don't evict people when they should. And so, I do think you have to kind of change your mindset a little bit, because the really good unsubsidized owners are invisible. You don't see them. You don't notice their buildings at all. The bad ones are the ones who drag everyone else down in terms of, giving everyone in that realm, a negative association. So I think it's interesting, because these are just regular folks. They start off small and unsophisticated, and some of them make a really great go of it and do a great job, and others don't. But I think that the responsible ones, you don't know who they are because they're really busy doing stuff and they don't go to conferences. And one thing, working with this part of the ownership, this unsubsidized part, they're always amazed when I invite them to meetings to talk about policy, or, we have a conference and we invite them and they say, wow, this is interesting. I learned a lot. We can influence things and do things. A lot of them, especially the smaller ones, are a little bit outside the loop, which is why, the connections are really important, and the capacity building is really important, because they're just kind of outside the regular networks.
Thank you both. That was really helpful context for this topic.
And Stacy, you know, the love is appreciated, and I think you keyed into kind of why I asked the question, because far too often in the affordable housing policy world, we kind of think through the lens of a mission-driven organization of medium to large size that engages in policy all the time and is connected to government a lot, and lose sight of the very real business challenges and approach of the folks who own and operate a whole lot of what is affordable housing for a good chunk of the country. So that, thank you to you and to Margaret for giving us some more perspective on it. I'll turn it back to Rebecca because I think there's probably some more questions from the webinar audience.
Well, I'm waiting to see if folks have questions, but I do have one I was hoping, Stacey, you could elaborate on a little bit. Going back to the 1 to 4 program that CIC has launched and recently expanded, I was just wondering if you could elaborate again on the expansion, like what's driving that? Is it just success of the program, getting to scale, kind of word of mouth, or neighborhood focus, kind of generating more investment, like what that dynamic is?
Sure. So CIC has been around for a long time, and we've financed multifamily for a long time. And I think, Margaret, you might have said the multifamily investors are different from the 1 to 4s investors, and that's absolutely true. So one issue is when we created this pool, and it's different than our multifamily pool, we actually have 2 tiers. We have a first tier that is kind of a safe tier that we have about 12 lender investors, and then we have a second tier for loans that could go up to as high as 120% loan to value, because these markets are low value, and because some of the rehab needs are quite high, we haven't had to go to 120%, but we can. So it's a unique structure. It's different. It's structured differently than our multifamily pool, but it did take a while for us to establish ourselves amongst that other investor class, and for us to get a good feel for underwriting those investors and identifying the strong investors who had a good track record and who had the capacity to take on more buildings. And so we started off just having, $1 million or, even less, I think the first year in volume. And the volume has picked up not because we finance really a lot of these investors, but because we actually have a mid-sized kind of cadre of investors that have done really good work, and some smaller ones who have come back and said, I know that last time we came, we didn't have permits. And our track record isn't that we're getting permits from the city, but here we've been doing this now for a year and a half, and look at our work, we're doing better. And so, we're actually growing that pool of responsible investors by holding them to a higher standard. So I do think that part of it was establishing ourselves in this kind of new field of 1 to 4s investing. And I also think this is a time limited. We never expected that this is going to be a line of business we'll have forever. The crash obviously yielded opportunities, quote unquote, for these types of folks to do this kind of redevelopment. And some of these neighborhoods are getting stronger, and there's owner occupant demand. And we don't want to do these deals in neighborhoods where there's owner occupant demand, because that means they're strengthening, and we'd rather invest in places that don't have other options where rental for these 1 to 4 unit buildings. Because again, we're weak markets we're working in. We're not working in the stronger markets with this program.
No, that's a good point about the owner occupancy and the kind of time limited approach to some of this work with 1 to 4s, because you are hoping that neighborhoods strengthen and maybe need less of this stock.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I'm not seeing other questions come in, and I really appreciate your time and this excellent content. Of course, I could keep asking you questions, but I will let you go and let our attendees go, and I may follow up by email because they're going to get really weedy really quick. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Mention our Solutions Conference on November 29th. We are launching registration this week, so be on the lookout for that. It's here in DC, and we're going to touch on a lot of different policy topics that day, so you definitely don't want to miss it. With that, I will close us out. We will be back in October 4th. We're going to talk about NHC's new paycheck report and hopefully some other kind of interesting collaboration that's happening in the field. So thanks again to Margaret and Stacy, and we will see everyone next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.